I'm Nanny, 62 years old, and I never thought I'd be sharing this story with you today. For 29 years, I raised my son Daniel all by myself after losing my husband in a car accident when Daniel was just 3. I gave him everything I had worked 2 jobs, sacrificed my dreams, and watched him grow into a successful man. But nothing could have prepared me for the day he looked me in the eyes and said those 4 devastating words: pay rent or leave. I never imagined those words would come from my own son, the little boy I tucked into bed every night, the young man I cheered for at every graduation. Before I share what happened next, let me know where you're watching from, and please, hit that like button. You won't believe how quickly everything changed after I made the decision that shocked him to his core. Looking back now, those early years feel like a different lifetime altogether. When David died in that terrible accident on Interstate 75, I was 33 years old with a 3-year-old son and no idea how I was going to make it through each day, let alone raise a child on my own. The insurance money helped for a while, but it wasn't enough to sustain us long term. I remember sitting at our kitchen table that first month after the funeral bills spread out in front of me like fallen leaves, Daniel playing with his toy trucks on the floor nearby. That's when I made the decision that would define the next 25 years of my life. I would do whatever it took to give Daniel the life his father would have wanted for him. I took a job as a cashier at the local grocery store during the morning shift, then worked evenings cleaning office buildings downtown. Some nights I didn't get home until after midnight, but Daniel never went to bed hungry, and he always had clean clothes for school. I sold my beloved 1992 Honda Accord, the last thing David and I had bought together, to help pay for Daniel's school supplies and extracurricular activities. When he wanted to join the soccer team in middle school, I picked up weekend shifts at the grocery store. When he needed a computer for high school, I worked extra cleaning jobs for 3 months straight. Every sacrifice felt worth it when I saw his face light up with excitement or pride. Our evenings together became sacred time. After I got home from my day job and before heading out for the evening shift, we'd sit at that same kitchen table where I'd once sorted through bills in despair. Daniel would spread out his homework while I helped him with math problems or listened to him read aloud from his history textbook. Those moments sitting side by side with the afternoon sunlight streaming through our small kitchen window felt like the most important work I'd ever do. Weekends were our special time. We'd make pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse heads, watch old movies together on our secondhand television, and tend to the small vegetable garden I'd planted in our backyard. Daniel loved helping me plant tomatoes and peppers each spring, his small hands carefully patting soil around the seedlings. In the summer, we'd sit on the back porch eating fresh tomatoes still warm from the sun juice running down our chins as we laughed about something silly that happened during the week. When Daniel graduated high school with a full scholarship to the State University for Engineering, I cried tears of pure joy and exhaustion. All those years of double shifts, of falling asleep in my work clothes, of choosing between groceries and new shoes for myself had led to this moment. He was going to have opportunities I never had, chances to build the kind of life his father would have been proud of. During his college years, Daniel would call me every Sunday evening. We'd talk about his classes, his friends, his dreams for the future. He'd tell me about the internships he was applying for and the projects he was working on. I'd tell him about my garden, about the new books I was reading from the library, about the neighbors who always asked how he was doing. Those phone calls sustained me through some of my loneliest moments. When he graduated summa cum laude and landed a position at a prestigious technology company in the city, making more money in his starting salary than I'd ever made in a full year, I felt like I could finally breathe. My baby had made it. All the sacrifices, all the sleepless nights worrying about money, all the years of putting his needs before my own had been worth every moment. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. 3 years ago, the arthritis in my hands and knees became so severe that I could barely manage my cleaning jobs. The constant bending, lifting, and scrubbing that had sustained us for decades suddenly became impossible. My doctor recommended early retirement and prescribed medications that helped with the pain, but came with price tags that made my eyes water. I tried to hide my struggles from Daniel at first. I didn't want to burden him with my problems when he was building his career and his life. But eventually the medical bills became too much. I had to sell our little house, the home where Daniel had grown up, where we'd made all those precious memories. The equity helped pay off the medical debt, but it left me with very little to start over. That's when Daniel stepped in like the hero I'd always known he could be. When I called to tell him about selling the house, trying to keep my voice steady and matter of fact, he immediately said, "Mom, you raised me. Now it's my turn to take care of you. Come live with me." His house was everything I'd dreamed he might have someday. A beautiful two-story colonial in a quiet suburban neighborhood with tree-lined streets and well-maintained gardens. 3 bedrooms, 2.5 bathrooms, and a kitchen that looked like something from a home improvement magazine. The backyard had a small garden area that reminded me of our old vegetable patch, and I could already imagine planting flowers there come spring. Those first few months living with Daniel felt like a gift I hadn't expected at this stage of my life. I'd wake up early, as I'd always done, and have coffee ready when he came down for breakfast. I'd pack his lunch in a brown bag just like I used to when he was in elementary school, slipping in little notes of encouragement that made him smile. During the day while he was at work, I'd tidy the house, do laundry, and plan dinner. I loved having someone to cook for again. Daniel had always been a good eater, and I enjoyed experimenting with new recipes I found online or remembered from my own mother's collection. The kitchen would fill with the smells of roast chicken, homemade bread, or my famous chocolate chip cookies that Daniel used to beg for as a child. When he'd come home in the evening tired from long days at the office, his face would light up when he smelled dinner cooking. We fell into a comfortable routine that felt natural and healing for both of us. Daniel would tell me about his projects at work, about the challenging problems he was solving with his team. I'd share stories about my day, about the neighbors I was getting to know, about the books I was reading. In the evenings, we'd sometimes watch television together or play card games at the kitchen table, just like old times. I started working in the garden, planting flowers and herbs around the border of his property. The physical activity was good for my arthritis, and I loved being outside in the fresh air. Daniel would sometimes join me on weekends, helping me plant new perennials or discussing where to put a small vegetable patch for next year. But after about 4 months, things began to shift in ways that were subtle at first. Daniel started mentioning a woman from his office named Madison. She was 25 years old, worked in the marketing department, and according to Daniel, she was really special. He'd light up when he talked about her in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager with his first crush. When he finally brought Madison home for dinner, I understood immediately why he was so smitten. She was absolutely stunning, with long auburn hair, perfectly applied makeup, and a smile that could light up a room. She wore designer clothes and carried herself with the confidence of someone much older than her years. I wanted to like her for Daniel's sake, and I tried my best to make her feel welcome. I prepared a special meal that first evening, setting the dining room table with my good china and lighting candles. I made Daniel's favorite pot roast with roasted vegetables and homemade rolls. Madison complimented the food politely, but I noticed she barely touched her plate. When I offered seconds, she laughed and said she was watching her figure. As the weeks passed, Madison became a regular presence in Daniel's life and, by extension, in our home. She'd come over after work some evenings, and Daniel would be completely focused on her. Our comfortable routine of sharing stories about our days gradually gave way to Daniel rushing through dinner so he could spend time with Madison in the living room or take her out somewhere. I tried to include Madison in conversations asking about her work and her interests. She'd answer politely, but briefly, always steering the conversation back to Daniel or finding reasons to pull him away for private conversations. I began to feel like a third wheel in my own living situation, though. I told myself I was being oversensitive. Madison started staying overnight on weekends, and I could sense her discomfort with the arrangement. She'd emerge from Daniel's room in the morning wearing one of his oversized shirts, her hair perfectly tousled in that way that takes effort to achieve. She'd smile at me politely, but never lingered for conversation, always eager to get Daniel out of the house for brunch or shopping or whatever activity she had planned. I started noticing small changes in Daniel's behavior. He'd glance at his phone more often during our conversations, distracted by text messages from Madison. He'd make plans for evenings without mentioning them to me, leaving me to discover I'd be eating dinner alone when he'd hurry past the kitchen in his good clothes, calling out that he'd be late getting home. Madison's influence on Daniel became more apparent as winter turned to spring. She had a way of making suggestions that sounded like casual observations but carried the weight of expectations. During one dinner conversation, she mentioned how refreshing it was to have privacy with a partner, how important it was for couples to have their own space to grow together without distractions. She was clever about it, never directly criticizing me or suggesting I was a problem. Instead, she'd make comments about friends of hers who lived alone about how independent and mature they seemed. She'd talk about apartments she'd seen online, mentioning how cozy and romantic it would be for just two people to share a space designed for intimacy. I watched Daniel absorbing these conversations with growing concern. He'd nod thoughtfully when Madison talked about independence and maturity as if he'd never considered these concepts before. She had a way of making him feel like living with his mother was somehow holding him back from becoming the man he was meant to be. Madison also had strong opinions about household arrangements that she shared with Daniel when she thought I couldn't hear. She'd comment on how unusual it was for a man his age to have his mother doing his laundry and cooking his meals. She'd suggest that perhaps it wasn't healthy for either of us to maintain such traditional mother-son dynamics now that he was a successful adult. The changes in our daily routine became more pronounced. Daniel asked me to stop packing his lunches, saying he preferred to buy food near his office. He requested that I not do his laundry anymore, claiming he needed to take more responsibility for himself. When Madison was coming over, he'd suggest I might enjoy spending the evening at the local library or community center. I tried to adapt to these new boundaries, telling myself that it was natural for Daniel to want more independence as he grew into a serious relationship. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Madison was systematically working to remove my presence from Daniel's daily life. She'd arrange for her friends to come over on evenings when she knew I typically watched my favorite television programs in the living room. Then, she'd apologize sweetly, saying she hadn't realized I had plans while making it clear that I was welcome to find somewhere else to spend the evening. Her friends were all young professionals like herself, and their conversations about work politics, expensive restaurants, and weekend trips to wine country made it clear that I didn't belong in their social circle. Madison also began commenting on household management in ways that felt like gentle criticisms. She'd notice when I rearranged items in the kitchen to make cooking more efficient, mentioning to Daniel how different things looked. She'd suggest that maybe it would be easier if everyone kept their personal items in their own spaces rather than shared areas. When I planted a small herb garden near the kitchen window so I could easily access fresh basil and oregano while cooking, Madison commented to Daniel about how the aesthetic of the space was changing. She showed him pictures on her phone of minimalist kitchens with clean lines and no personal touches, sighing about how sophisticated and adult those spaces looked. Daniel started echoing Madison's language in his conversations with me. He'd talk about fairness and balance in household contributions. He'd mention articles he'd read online about multi-generational living arrangements and the importance of clearly defined boundaries and mutual respect for independence. I could see Madison's fingerprints all over these new concepts that seemed to spring fully formed from Daniel's mind. He'd never shown any interest in household management theories or independence philosophies before she arrived in his life. But now he'd bring up these topics during dinner conversations, speaking with the authority of someone who'd given them deep thought. The breaking point came when Madison started talking about her lease renewal. She mentioned casually that her landlord was raising her rent significantly, making it difficult for her to afford her current apartment on her marketing salary. She'd sigh about the challenges of finding affordable housing in the city, about how much easier it would be to split expenses with someone she cared about. Daniel immediately offered to help her look at apartments closer to his neighborhood, suggesting she could practically live at his house while apartment hunting. But Madison had a different idea. Why should she pay rent somewhere else when she was spending most of her time at his place anyway? Wouldn't it make more sense for her to move in and split household expenses equally? The conversation that changed everything happened on a Thursday evening in late April. Madison had gone home to her apartment to pick up some clothes, leaving Daniel and me alone in the house for the first time in weeks. I was folding laundry in the living room when Daniel came downstairs and sat across from me in his father's old recliner. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, and something in his tone made me set down the towel I was holding and give him my full attention. His voice had a formality to it that I'd never heard before, as if he'd rehearsed what he was about to say. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" I asked, though something in my stomach was already starting to twist with anxiety. Daniel took a deep breath and looked directly at me. "I think it's time you start contributing to household expenses. Pay rent or find your own place." The words hit me like a physical blow. For a moment, I couldn't process what he'd said. This was Daniel, my baby, the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, the teenager who'd hugged me tight after his high school graduation and whispered, "Thank you for everything, Mom," in my ear. "Daniel, are you serious?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm completely serious," he replied, and his tone was cooler than I'd ever heard it. "Madison and I have been talking, and we think it's important for everyone in this household to contribute equally. It's about fairness, Mom. It's about treating each other as adults with equal responsibilities." I stared at him, searching his face for some sign of the son I'd raised, but he looked like a stranger wearing Daniel's features. "Sweetheart, you know I'm living on Social Security. My monthly income barely covers my medications and personal expenses. Where would I get money for rent?" "That's something you'll need to figure out," he said, and I could hear Madison's influence in every syllable. "Everyone needs to take responsibility for their own financial situation. I can't be expected to support you indefinitely." The word support stung more than anything else he'd said. Is that how he saw the life we'd built together in his home? All those dinners I'd cooked, all the laundry I'd folded, all the care I'd put into making his house feel like a warm and welcoming home, was that just freeloading in his mind? "Daniel, I've been taking care of this house, cooking your meals, doing your laundry," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Doesn't that count as contributing?" He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of the old Daniel in his eyes. But then his expression hardened again. "That's in the past, Mom. We need to move forward with a more equitable arrangement. Madison's going to be moving in next month, and we need to establish clear boundaries about expenses and responsibilities." So there it was. Madison was moving in, and there wasn't room for both of us in Daniel's life. I felt something cold and final settle in my chest as the full picture became clear. "How much rent are you asking for?" I asked quietly. $800 a month," he replied without hesitation. "That's 1/3 of the mortgage, utilities, and household expenses. It's completely fair." $800, nearly my entire Social Security check. He might as well have asked me for $8,000 or $8 million. The amount made it clear that this wasn't really about fairness or equity. This was about making it impossible for me to stay. "You have 1 week to decide, Mom," Daniel continued, and I could tell he was eager to end this conversation. "Pay or leave. I need to know what you're planning to do so Madison and I can make our own arrangements." I sat there in stunned silence for several long moments, looking at this man who shared my eyes and my chin, but seemed to have none of my heart. All those years of sacrifice, all those nights I'd worked until my hands bled to give him opportunities, all the love I'd poured into raising him, and it had led to this moment. "I understand," I said, finally standing up from the couch. My voice was calmer than I felt, and I was proud of myself for not crying or begging or making a scene. "Thank you for being direct about what you want." Daniel looked slightly surprised by my composed response, as if he'd expected me to argue or plead. "I'm glad you're being reasonable about this, Mom. I know it's a big change, but it's for the best." I nodded once and walked upstairs to my room, closing the door behind me with a soft click. Only then did I allow myself to sink onto my bed and let the tears fall. But even as I cried, a part of my mind was already working, already planning what I needed to do next. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house settling around me. Down the hall, I could hear Daniel moving around in his room, and I wondered if he was having trouble sleeping too. But when Madison's car pulled into the driveway around 11:30, and I heard her voice in the hallway, I realized that any sleeplessness on Daniel's part probably had nothing to do with our conversation. By morning, I'd made my decision. I wouldn't beg and I wouldn't argue. I certainly wouldn't try to come up with $800 a month to rent space in the home where I'd been a welcomed family member just 24 hours earlier. Instead, I would leave with my dignity intact and let Daniel learn what life was like without the mother who had devoted her entire adult life to his well-being. The first call I made was to my sister Patricia, who lived in Phoenix, Arizona. Patricia was 3 years younger than me and had never had children of her own. She'd built a successful career as a nurse and had retired to a comfortable life in a senior community with golf courses and swimming pools. We'd stayed in touch over the years, but the distance had kept us from being as close as we might have been. Nanny! Patricia's voice was surprised when she answered the phone. We usually only talked on holidays and birthdays. Is everything okay? I need to ask a favor, I said without preamble. Can I come stay with you for a while? I'll explain everything when I see you, but I need to leave Daniel's house. Patricia didn't ask questions, bless her heart. Of course you can stay with me. How soon do you need to come? Today, if possible, I can book a flight this afternoon. I'll pick you up at the airport. Text me your flight information. My next call was to the airline. I used my credit card to book a one-way ticket to Phoenix, departing at 4:15 that afternoon. It would use up most of my available credit, but I'd worry about paying it off later. Then I began the heartbreaking task of packing my life into 2 suitcases. I'd accumulated so few possessions over the years, always prioritizing Daniel's needs over my own wants. Most of what I owned fit easily into the luggage I'd bought for a trip Daniel and I had taken to visit colleges when he was 17. I packed my clothes, my medications, and a few precious photographs. I left behind the books I'd been reading, the craft supplies I'd bought to make Christmas ornaments, and the small gardening tools I'd used to plant flowers around Daniel's property. I wanted to travel light, and I wanted to leave no excuse for Daniel to contact me about forgotten belongings. The hardest decision was what to do about the gifts I'd given Daniel over the years. His bookshelf was filled with novels I'd bought him for birthdays and Christmas mornings. The kitchen contained gadgets I'd purchased to make his life easier. I'd contributed small touches throughout the house that made it feel more like a home and less like a bachelor pad. I decided to leave everything exactly as it was. Those gifts had been given freely with love, and taking them back would feel petty and small. If Daniel wanted reminders of our relationship in his home, they would be there. If he wanted to remove them to make room for Madison's belongings, that was his choice to make. The only thing I took that might have surprised him was the small framed photo of Daniel and me from his college graduation. It had been sitting on the hallway table, and it was one of my favorite pictures of the 2 of us together. Daniel was wearing his cap and gown, his arm around my shoulders, both of us grinning at the camera with pure joy. I slipped it into my suitcase between 2 sweaters where it wouldn't get damaged during the flight. I wrote a brief note and left it on the kitchen counter where Daniel would be sure to see it when he came down for breakfast. It said simply, "Daniel, I've decided to accept your suggestion that I find my own place. I'm going to stay with Patricia in Arizona while I figure out my next steps. Thank you for giving me a home for these months. I hope you and Madison will be very happy together. Love, always, Mom." I didn't write anything about being hurt or disappointed. I didn't mention the years of sacrifice or the love I'd poured into raising him. I kept it simple and dignified, the way I wanted to handle this entire situation. At 11:30 in the morning, while Daniel was at work and Madison was presumably at her job, I called a taxi to take me to the airport. I took one last walk through the house, remembering the good months we'd had before everything went wrong. I touched the herbs growing in my little garden by the kitchen window and hoped someone would water them. Then I picked up my 2 suitcases, walked out the front door, and closed it behind me for the last time. As the taxi pulled away from the house, I sent Daniel a single text message. "I've found my own place. Take care, Daniel." Then I turned off my phone and settled back in the seat, watching the familiar neighborhood disappear behind us. For the first time in days, I felt something like peace. The first call came 3 days after I'd left. I was sitting by Patricia's pool reading a mystery novel and sipping iced tea when my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen, but I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to hear his voice yet, and I had a feeling that whatever he had to say wouldn't be an apology. The voicemail confirmed my instincts. "Mom, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Daniel's voice was angry, not hurt or remorseful. "You can't just disappear without talking to me first. I come home to find you gone and some cryptic note about finding your own place. This is completely irresponsible behavior. Call me back immediately." I deleted the message without replying. The second call came that evening. This time, Daniel's tone was more frustrated than angry. "Mom, I don't understand why you're being so dramatic about this. All I asked was for you to contribute to household expenses like any other adult. Running away to Arizona isn't solving anything. Madison and I were willing to work with you on a payment plan if money was tight. Call me back so we can discuss this reasonably." I deleted that message too. Meanwhile, Patricia and I were having long conversations about everything that had happened. She listened without judgment as I told her about Daniel's transformation, about Madison's subtle manipulations, about the impossible ultimatum that had led to my departure. "You did the right thing," Patricia said as we sat on her patio, watching the desert sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "That boy needed to learn what life is like without his mother taking care of every detail." Patricia's retirement community was unlike anything I'd experienced before. There were walking trails and fitness classes designed for seniors. There was a library with comfortable reading chairs and large print books. There were social activities every evening, from card games to movie nights to discussion groups about current events. For the first time in my adult life, I was living somewhere designed entirely around my own needs and interests, rather than someone else's. I could eat dinner at 5:30 if I wanted to, or at 8 o'clock if I preferred. I could watch whatever television programs appealed to me without worrying about whether someone else found them boring. I could wake up in the morning and decide how to spend my day based solely on what sounded appealing to me. Daniel continued calling, leaving increasingly frustrated voicemails. By the end of the first week, his messages had shifted from anger to bewilderment. "Mom, I don't understand what's happening here. The house feels wrong without you. Nothing's working the way it used to. Please just call me back so we can figure this out." But I still wasn't ready to talk to him. I was finally beginning to understand how much of my identity had been wrapped up in being Daniel's mother and taking care of his needs and anticipating his wants. Living with Patricia, I was rediscovering parts of myself that I'd set aside decades earlier. I joined a book club that met every Tuesday morning to discuss mysteries and romance novels. I started taking water aerobics classes at the community center pool. I volunteered at a local elementary school, helping children with reading skills that reminded me of those evening homework sessions with young Daniel. Meanwhile, according to Patricia's occasional check-ins with mutual acquaintances back home, Daniel's life was becoming increasingly chaotic. Apparently, Madison had moved in as planned, but the transition wasn't going as smoothly as either of them had anticipated. Daniel discovered that maintaining a household involved far more work than he'd realized when I was handling most of the daily tasks. Laundry had to be sorted, washed, dried, and folded on a regular schedule, or there would be no clean clothes for work. Meals had to be planned, ingredients purchased, food prepared, and cleaned up afterward every single day. Bills had to be organized and paid on time to keep utilities running and avoid late fees. Madison, it turned out, had no interest in domestic responsibilities. She'd moved in expecting to share a well-maintained home with Daniel, not to contribute to the daily work of keeping that home functional. When Daniel asked her to help with household tasks, she reminded him that she was paying rent now and shouldn't be expected to provide free labor on top of her financial contribution. Their first major fight was about groceries. Daniel had assumed that Madison would share cooking duties, but she preferred eating out or ordering takeout from expensive restaurants. When he suggested they take turns preparing meals to save money, she laughed and told him she didn't know how to cook anything more complicated than scrambled eggs. The second fight was about cleanliness standards. Madison was accustomed to having a cleaning service maintain her apartment, and she found Daniel's attempts at housekeeping inadequate. But when he suggested hiring professional cleaners, she balked at the expense and suggested he simply needed to work harder to keep things tidy. By the 10th day of my absence, Daniel's voicemails had taken on a tone of genuine desperation. "Mom, please come home. I know I made mistakes, but we can work this out. Madison and I are having problems, and I realize now that I didn't appreciate everything you were doing for us. The house is falling apart without you. I'm falling apart without you. Please just give me a chance to make this right." On the 14th day after I'd left Daniel's house, my phone rang at 6 in the morning. Arizona time. I answered without checking the caller ID, assuming it must be an emergency for someone to call so early. "Mom!" Daniel's voice was thick with tears, and I could tell immediately that something fundamental had changed. "Mom, please don't hang up. I know I don't deserve to have you listen to me, but I need to tell you how sorry I am." I settled back against my pillows and waited for him to continue. "Madison left yesterday," he said, and I could hear him struggling not to cry. "She said living with me was too much work and not enough fun. She said I was boring and needy and that she never signed up to be a housekeeper or a therapist. Mom, I was so wrong about everything. I was wrong about her, and I was wrong about you, and I don't know how to fix what I've broken." I listened as my son poured out the story of the past 2 weeks, how he'd burned 3 dinners in a row because he'd never learned to cook anything more complicated than microwave meals, how he'd shrunk his favorite shirts by washing them in hot water because he'd never paid attention to my careful sorting and temperature selection, how he'd run out of clean towels because he'd forgotten that laundry was an ongoing process, not a one-time event. "The house doesn't feel like home anymore," he said. "It feels like a building where I sleep and store my stuff. I never realized that you were the one who made it feel like a place where I belonged. I never understood that all those little things you did, cooking and cleaning and just being there when I came home from work, those things weren't just chores. They were love. They were you loving me every single day in ways I was too stupid and selfish to recognize." He told me about Madison's increasing complaints and criticisms, how she'd criticized the way he loaded the dishwasher, folded laundry, and arranged furniture, how she'd compared him unfavorably to her ex-boyfriends who had more sophisticated tastes and better social connections, how she'd made it clear that she'd expected their relationship to provide her with a more luxurious lifestyle than Daniel's middle-class engineer salary could support. "She never loved me," Daniel said, his voice breaking completely. "She loved the idea of having a boyfriend with a house and a steady income. When I asked her to help maintain the home we were supposed to be sharing, she acted like I was asking her to sacrifice her entire identity. But, Mom, you gave up everything for me for years and years, and I threw it all away for someone who couldn't even pretend to care about me when things got difficult." I felt my heart breaking for my son, but also felt a deep sense of vindication. Everything I'd sensed about Madison, all the red flags I'd noticed but kept to myself, had proven accurate. "Daniel," I said softly, speaking to him for the first time since I'd left his house, "I'm glad you're beginning to understand these things. But understanding what went wrong isn't enough. You need to think about why you made the choices you made and what you're going to do differently in the future." "I know," he whispered. "Mom, I want to do better. I want to be the son you raised me to be, not the selfish man I turned into. Will you please come home? Will you give me another chance to show you that I can be better?" I looked out Patricia's window at the desert landscape, at the life I'd been building for myself over the past 2 weeks. It was a good life, peaceful and independent. For the first time in my adult life, I was living entirely for myself, making choices based on my own preferences and needs. "I'll come for a visit," I said finally. "But Daniel, I won't be moving back in with you. I'm building a life here in Arizona, and I'm happier than I've been in years. If you want a relationship with me going forward, it needs to be based on mutual respect and appreciation, not on you needing someone to take care of domestic responsibilities you should handle yourself." We talked for another hour about what had happened, about how things had gone so wrong so quickly, about what kind of relationship we might build going forward. Daniel cried and apologized repeatedly, and I could hear genuine remorse in his voice. But I also knew that apologies were only meaningful if they were followed by lasting changes in behavior. I booked a flight to visit Daniel 2 weeks later, giving him time to get his household somewhat organized, and giving myself time to think about what boundaries I needed to establish. When I arrived at his house, I barely recognized the confident young man who'd issued ultimatums a month earlier. Daniel looked exhausted and overwhelmed. His hair was uncombed, his clothes were wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. The house that had once been pristine was cluttered with takeout containers, unfolded laundry, and stacks of unpaid bills. "Mom," he said, when he opened the front door, and then he just stood there looking at me as if he wasn't sure whether I was real. "You came back." "I came to visit," I corrected gently. "We need to talk about what kind of relationship we're going to have going forward." We spent 3 days together, talking more honestly than we had in years. Daniel told me about the loneliness he'd felt growing up without his father, about the pressure he'd felt to be successful enough to justify all my sacrifices. He told me about his fears that he'd never be able to take care of me the way I'd taken care of him, and how Madison had seemed to offer an easy solution to those fears by suggesting I was too dependent on him. I told him about the years of exhaustion and worry, about the dreams I'd set aside to focus on his needs, about the identity crisis I'd experienced when he no longer seemed to need me. I told him about the new life I was building in Arizona, about the friends I was making, and the activities that brought me joy. We cried together and laughed together and slowly began to rebuild a relationship based on who we were now, not who we'd been when he was a child and I was his overwhelmed single mother. But I also made it clear that I wouldn't be moving back into his house, not now, and not in the future. I'd learned too much about my own needs and desires to give up the independence I'd discovered. Instead, we would build a relationship based on choice, rather than necessity, on love, rather than obligation. When I returned to Arizona, I used some of my savings to put a deposit on a small apartment in Patricia's retirement community. It was a one-bedroom unit with a tiny balcony where I could grow herbs and flowers. It was just large enough for my needs and completely my own. Daniel and I talk on the phone every Sunday now, just like we did when he was in college. But our conversations are different now. We talk as adults who choose to be part of each other's lives, not as a dependent child and a sacrificing parent. He tells me about his work, his attempts at cooking the house projects he's tackling one room at a time. I tell him about my book club, my volunteer work, the friends I've made in my new community. He visits me in Arizona twice a year, and I visit him for a week each summer. When I'm in his house now, I'm a guest, not a housekeeper. He cooks meals for me, showing off the skills he's developed since Madison left. He takes me on tours of local attractions and introduces me to his neighbors as his mother, with obvious pride and affection. The relationship we have now is healthier than anything we had before. It's based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than guilt and obligation. We both had to lose each other to learn how to love each other properly. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the space to realize what they've lost, and sometimes walking away is the strongest thing you can do. I learned that loving someone doesn't mean sacrificing your dignity or your sense of self-worth. True love grows when both people respect each other's independence and choose to be together rather than staying together out of habit or fear. My life in Arizona isn't the life I'd planned when I was 33 years old with a 3-year-old son and no idea how I'd make it through each day. But it's a life I've chosen for myself, built around my own interests and needs. And my relationship with Daniel, though different than I once imagined it would be, is stronger and more authentic than it ever was when we were living under the same roof. I learned that it's never too late to discover who you are when you're not defined entirely by your relationships with other people. And I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's selfish behavior, even when that someone is your own child. If you're facing a similar situation with family members who take your love and care for granted, I want you to know that you deserve respect and appreciation. You deserve to have your contributions acknowledged and valued. And sometimes the only way to teach someone your worth is to show them what life is like without you in it. What lessons have you learned about family relationships and setting boundaries? Have you ever had to make the difficult choice to walk away from someone you love in order to preserve your own dignity and self-respect? Share your stories in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you and learn from your experiences. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe to this channel for more real-life stories about family relationships and finding the courage to make difficult but necessary changes. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that their worth isn't determined by how much they're willing to sacrifice for others. Thank you for listening to my story and for being part of this community where we support each other through life's challenges. Remember that you are valuable, you are worthy of respect, and you have the strength to make changes that honor your own well-being. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video.